Hello, everyone. My name is Donna Conwell.
And I'm Kelly Seacat, and we're your hosts for Scratch Space.
Scratch Space is a virtual forum hosted by the Lucas Artist Residency Program at Montalvo Art Center, which is located in Saratoga, California, on the ancestral lands of the Ohlone people. With Scratch Space, we're bringing together visual artists, scholars, composers, activists, writers, and others to explore what kinds of radical imaginaries can unfold in this moment of pandemic, racial reckoning, economic uncertainty, civil unrest, and environmental crisis.
We're interested in how we think about what is possible and how we can use our imaginations to build a better present and future, and how we can retool and create better and more equitable models for living and working together. So tell me, Donna, about our guests today.
Well, Kelly, I'm delighted to introduce our guests this week. We're joined by visual artist Indira Allegra and curator Erin Christovale. Indira is an artist whose work explores memorial as a genre and a vital part of human experience. Indira uses weaving as a methodology to explore the repetitive crossing of forces held under tension, be they material, social, or emotional. They are a Yerba Buena 100 honoree, a 2019-2020 Burke Prize winner, Flesh Hacker Eureka Fellow, Lucas Artist Fellow, and a California Black Voices Project grantee. And Erin Christovale is a Los Angeles-based curator and programmer who currently works as an associate curator at the Hammer Museum at the University of California in Los Angeles. Erin's recent projects include Belonging, a collection show responding to Bell Hook's collection of essays, Belonging, a Culture of Place, at the Hammer Museum, as well as Collective Constellations, selections from the Eileen Harris Norton Collective at Art and Practice. In 2019, before the pandemic forced the Lucas Artist Residency Program to temporarily close, we were really looking forward to welcoming Indira to our program. And instead, we found ourselves reaching out to see if Indira would like to participate in Scratch Space. Indira said they would be interested in being in conversation with Erin. And Indira had not met Erin yet at that point. So we're really delighted that Scratch Space can sort of facilitate this connection, and really excited for the conversation today.
Yes, we are, Donna. You'll find both Erin and Indira's bios in the chat. And I want to thank Nathan Zanon, who's joining us behind the scenes as our producer, as well as Eric, who'll be providing live captioning for this event. To access the live captioning, please press the button at the bottom of your screen with the CC. We'll now turn the floor over. Welcome Indira and Erin to the screen, and Donna and I will step aside and we'll come and rejoin the conversation about 1:45.
Thank you.
Hello, Erin.
Hi.
Hello, Indira.
Everyone.
I'm thrilled to have you here today. We'll be back.
Sounds good. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Donna and Kelly, and thank you, Indira, for reaching out to be in conversation. I feel like, yeah, I think one of the many things, or I would say residues of this pandemic, is getting to know folks in a digital space, and in a way feeling more comfortable to sort of engage initially in this space. And so I appreciate you reaching out. And yeah, prompting me to be in conversation. This is really exciting.
Oh, thank you. I'm so honored to be with you and to think about the surface of the cloth and the surface of the screen, portals through which we can imagine whatever we're going to imagine. And I, yes, want to say also my thank you to Donna and Kelly for creating this Scratch Space environment. And What I'd like to do is read a selection from The Sovereignty of Quiet. And this is a text which came out in 2012 by Kevin Quashie. The Sovereignty of Quiet, Beyond Resistance in Black Culture. Highly recommended if you haven't read it yet. It was on time then, it's on time now. And yeah, just see what he has to offer in terms of thinking about quiet, since I think this moment also serves as a portal wherein more folks are interested in and have courage to investigate their own experiences of quiet or interiority. So quiet, a quality or sensibility of being as a manner of expression. This expressiveness of quiet is not concerned with publicness, but instead with the expressiveness of the interior. It suggests what is essentially and indescribably human. The interior is the inner reservoir of thoughts, feelings, desires, fears, ambitions that shape a human self. It is both a space of wild self-fullness, a kind of self-indulgence, and the locus at which self-interrogation takes place. Said another way, the interior is expansive, voluptuous, creative, impulsive, and dangerous. It is not subject to one's control, but instead has to be taken on its own terms. Despite its name, the interior is not connected, not unconnected to the world of things, the public or political or social world. Nor is it an exact antonym for exterior. Instead, the interior shifts in regard to life stimuli, but is neither resistant to nor overdetermined by vagaries of the outer world. The interior has its own ineffable integrity, and it is a stay against the social world. Thank you, Kevin Quashie. How is your interior today?
It's good. It's filled with a lot of possibilities. I'm feeling optimistic. I think despite what you mentioned offline, the senseless killings of several people yesterday, and thinking about how Asian American folks are under attack, I think in this past year specifically, and yeah, how we can just continue to support folks within that community, but also raise awareness of these ongoing issues. I wanted to sort of raise this question of surface that you brought up, because it sort of put some things together for me, which is, I love the moving image. The realm of the cinematic has always been a sort of centerpiece to my understanding of narrative, aesthetic, and I think overall art making. And is a space in which I think I've learned how to become, a film programmer and also a curator. And, I've been sort of curating and programming in this realm for many years, and really trying to prioritize experimental and avant-garde moving image by Black, visual artists and filmmakers within the diaspora. And one of the most recent projects that I curated was with artist and filmmaker Jatavia Gary, who is based in Texas, who is just an incredible filmmaker. And the project that we worked on together was the Giverny Suite, which was a project that Jatavia has been making several iterations of. And One of the things that I learned in that process of working with Jatavia is that there's a particular group of artists and filmmakers, specifically Black femme folks, who are really thinking about texture and surface within the cinematic. And what I mean by that is they are actively sort of, and I would use the term weaving together um, various sources and footage, and sort of thinking about how the digital lays on top of film, or what it means to source something from YouTube and pair it with something that's sourced from the archive that's in 16 millimeter.
Mhm,
And sort of, in my opinion, actually creating cinematic tapestries.
mhm, mhm,
And so for me, so much of that for me sort of comes back to, I think a lot about the women in G's Bend. And I think a lot about quilt making as something that you know, uh, was an innovative practice and is, a point of Black cultural production that is led by Black femmes and historically has, and is in a lot of way an origin story of creation in this country.
mhm,
And so when I see this type of work being done in the cinematic realm, so much of that brings me back to a source, a creative source. Um, and I think an argument as to, who the first modernists really were, what aesthetics mean in a sort of painterly canon, and how we can actually tie that back to the work of these quilt makers and our grandmothers and our aunts and our great grandmothers, and this ancestral lineage that is so deep.
mhm,
So I wanted to sort of start there as a way of thinking about how to bridge, sort of weaving and textile
mhm,
into a cinematic space.
mhm. Absolutely. I feel that what could easily be, I almost want to say, dismissed as a smooth surface is really striated, as you have just laid out. Um, and for me, I feel when I feel witnessed by artworks and other objects in my home, it's because I'm relating to them as striated spaces. Um, I think about the moving image as a form of upholstery, which is why like the wall is not necessarily, can be an option for projection, but I feel like doesn't need to be. And one of the things when I'm actually able to get out to Montalvo, when they open again, is to think about in my own practice, editing to many different types of surfaces, um, rather than only editing to a screen. So how would it change the work to edit to the texture of a redwood tree
Mm, mm-hmm,
and to be in collaboration with that kind of,
mm.
yeah, with that kind of offering? Um, my question for you is, what was the first surface that you felt witnessed by, if
Mm.
that was a thing for you?
I think perhaps in a lot of ways, and this is speaking from like an embodied memory. It's like the insides of my mother's womb.
Mm,
A space that formed me literally, and a space that held me as I sort of slowly came together and was pushed out into this world. Um, and, I love the way that you speak of not only surface as this sort of activated, energized space or material, right, that we can engage with. But also I'm thinking about the way in which you think about energy transfer and this idea that every object, everything, every being holds energy. And so I wanted to sort of mention two things. The first thing is that you mentioned redwood trees, and I was thinking of your piece Surrogate.
Mhm, mhm,
And I wanted to talk about that because I think, or more specifically about ropes and binding in your work overall.
mhm, mhm,
Because as I was sort of looking through some of your work, and even as I was looking through your Body Warp series and seeing how you were engaging in a more performative way with the loom, but also, with ropes in general. Um, it was interesting because there's this tension in my mind. The tension was between thinking about historically how Black Americans, what our history is with ropes and
mhm,
violence,
mhm,
the sort of very visceral and violent history of that. But then also thinking about other cultural points. For example, thinking about shibari, which is a Japanese binding technique, and thinking about that as a sort of liberatory space.
mhm.
And so I'm very curious, when you are engaging with ropes and when you are thinking about binding, what sort of historical or cultural references are you also considering?
Mm. Oh, wow. I feel like so for Surrogate, Mother to Myself, what you see there are two redwood logs, which have been installed at the top of the hill on the winter solstice of 2017. And they're looking out toward the Pacific Ocean. And 600 feet of cotton lead line rope, which is used to work with horses. So one of the things which had happened, and I'm glad you brought that work up because yeah, it's a great way for me to talk about haunting. So
Mhm.
basically what had happened was I had been invited to go out to the Jurassic Artist Residency. And it's an international residency, but it's located in Northern California. And the first night there, I was totally unable to sleep.
Mm.
And so for me, I pay attention to things like that. I just kind of filed it away. And the next day when they were giving us the orientation to the space, a small mention was made that the residency was set up in honor of a woman named Pamela Gerasi, who had died by suicide on the ranch land. But then also look at the view, and we'll be making your meal this evening at 6 p.m. Please be on time and ready to mingle with other artists. And I was like, pause.
Right.
Can we just run that back really quick and talk about Pamela just a
Mhm.
little bit? And yeah, and so I came to initially there was some difficulty, I would say, in being able to access her archive of work, and she was an MFA student at Stanford, which was about like 45 minutes away.
Mm.
But eventually I was able to be granted permission to have access to her diaries or her poems, which are kind of like her diaries, which are published after her death. And in reading those, I was able to learn more about the materials which were important to her in her daily life. But all of this starts out from me not being able to sleep at night and paying attention to that intuition as being a valuable part of a story and not really knowing what the story was yet, but knowing that there was something there.
Mhm.
And then moving from that intuitive place into a space of okay, fingers to the keyboard research. And I'm not a scientist, but I would even say that within that sphere, questions are I don't know how you could divorce inquiry from intuition.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of working with rope or the double strand twist of any kind, I would say that actually behind that is a practice of trusting in the presence of unseen forces as they make themselves known to me. And then from there, being able to, I would say, be led to the right people to ask questions, you know, and have a sense of persistence around that. And I think that coming from a place of having done a lot of direct service type jobs before immersing myself in the fine art world, I'm able to sit in the tension of a person being like, ooh,
Mm-hmm.
no one else came here and wanted to talk about the suicide. What?
Right.
You know? And that's okay. I'm here.
Right.
And because I have a craft sensibility about time, all we got is time. I can wait.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, I love what Adrienne Marie Brown says around like moving at the speed of trust.
Right.
So I think when doing site-specific work and when doing public work, it's like, yeah, one can use a craft sensibility around that kind of trust temporality. Which leads me to my question for you, which is what is the role of love in curatorial practice?
I love that transition. And thank you for speaking about that work. I think it's so striking, and I think it does the work of another work of yours, which we'll get to in a bit, in thinking about memorial and how we as a society view memorial, but how memorial can be engaged in and embodied in so many different types of ways. But in terms of love, I think that, when I think of the word curating, for me, it very much is an act of care, because in a very literal sense, a curator is caring for objects, typically, right, within some sort of art institutional space. One of my incredible colleagues, who's now a curator at the Serpentine in London, Yusomi Umulu, wrote this incredible piece called The 14 Points of Care and Limitations. I hope I'm saying that title correctly. Over the summer, somewhat in response to the various uprisings that happened in response to not only George Floyd's death, but so many others. And also to, I think, a real reckoning that was erupting within the art world. And Yosomi sort of outlined, the history of museums, and thinking of them as these vestiges of colonialism, right? That we all sort of grapple with as soon as we come, quote unquote, institutionalized. But also wanted to sort of pivot and think to the future and sort of raise the question of, so it's very clear that the museum knows how to take care of objects, but how can the museum learn how to take care of bodies, and specifically BIPOC bodies, queer bodies, Indigenous bodies? And I thought that this was such an incredible prompt because it made me reflect on my time within my museum. And one of the most formative, incredible, life-altering exchanges that I had with an artist within that space. And that was actually the first show that I did, Made in LA 2018. Made in LA is our ongoing biennial in LA. I co-curated it with Anne Elgood, who was a senior curator there at the time. And we essentially worked with 32 artists to sort of realize new work, who were all sort of based in LA County. But there is one artist in particular, E.J. Hill, who's known mainly as a performance artist who does durational performances. And long story short, EJ is someone who's born and raised in Los Angeles, basically wanted to do a work that was responding to the education system within LA County, thinking about the fact that he had gone through seven different sort of academic institutions during his time here. And all of the sort of questions, traumas, issues, discoveries that those experiences raise, and sort of thinking through beyond these spaces as solely being spaces of academia, what are all of the social, interior, and personal discoveries that one sort of experiences in those spaces. And so he sort of created this environment, and in the middle of that environment that was sort of mimicking a track and field space, created a podium that sort of mimicked the podium that you would see during the Olympics, during the award ceremony. And EJ made the decision to stand on the first place of that podium for the entirety of the exhibition, which was 3 months. And so what that meant is that every day that we were open, EJ was on that pedestal. And he also decided that during that time, he would take no breaks to eat, no breaks to use the restroom, and essentially stood in place during our open hours for every single day that summer. And I say all of this to say that I think this was such a powerful lesson for me in love, and how love sort of ties back to my curatorial practice, because I was no longer caring for an object, I was caring for a human being, and specifically a Black queer human being in a space that is rooted in these types of histories. And so I think that experience, that relationship, really helped me define how love sort of enters my practice.
Mm. Mm.
But, you know, I wanted to talk about.
Wait.
Okay.
There's a question which is coming up for me around like, how do we know when objects have had enough, when they need to be put back into a womb-like space?
I mean, it's funny that you mentioned that, because going back into the museum space, there is a very sort of scientific and cold way of thinking through that, right? Which is when an object, particularly an older object, has now sort of become sensitive to natural light or being exposed or out in the world, there are procedures put in place by registrars and conservators in which it is decided how long that object can live in public space and what sort of procedural, sort of almost surgical applications are put onto it once it goes back into its storage space, right? And so, you know, in some ways, to me, these seem like very sort of cold, you know, procedures and, you know, just ways of preserving the work. But to the question that you posed, these are procedures that are more so put in place because the museum holds a monetary value to the work and not necessarily because the object itself is sort of ready to retreat into a quieter space, right? So again, this is sort of rooted in the history of museums. And, you know, it makes me think of, again, how you sort of perceive objects as being alive and holding energy. And it makes me want to ask this question to you, which is, you know, how you're thinking of the anatomy of a textile. But also, I wanted you to speak a bit about the various materials and technologies that allow for a textile to be made, right? Because when I think of looms, I think of wood. When I think of threads and yarn, I think of goats. When I think about the pigment that needs to be created in order to color these textiles, I think of minerals and throughout all of this, I think of the hand, right? And touch and engagement. And so I was just wondering what that means, these sort of very organic forms that come together to create a textile, and how through these various organic forms that textile is then allowed to live.
I mean, when I think of cloth, I think of narrative. That is the first, weaving is 30,000 years old. So we needed something 30,000 years ago to be able to tell a story outside of our body, to decide at a moment that what we had to say couldn't quite be all contained here. So to make something else which could reflect that back to us. Before the hand was the narrative, was the story. So when I first saw Loom, I understood it to be a writing device. I came to being a visual artist by being a poet. Initially, the Loom, I'm only 5'5", with kitten heels on. So
Love it.
so when I saw a floor loom, which was about the scale of my body, I was actually really intimidated. Because it kind of looked like, I was like, is this a torture device? Like, what's happening?
Right.
What's supposed to happen here? What kind of activity are we engaging in? And then I realized that, oh, once you dress the loom, so for the uninitiated, it means just putting the warp on, and the warp is the thread that runs this way, and the weft is the thread that runs this way. Once you dress the loom, you're just laying in stanzas. That's all it is. So I said, oh, okay, I can write poetry this way too. Cool. And I think with my practice, I'm really interested in, yes, great, the loom is, we've been doing this for 30,000 years, y'all. So this is a site of education for working with tension, for telling story. How can we take that off the loom and work with tension out in the world.
Mm.
Because we could keep weaving cloth, which is beautiful. It's a sacred practice. But for me, the challenge is in how I apply those skills out in the world. So when I think of the constituent parts of weaving, I think about, I think about narrative, and I think about tension, because you can't tell a good story without a tension point.
Mm. And yeah, I mean, that's really interesting to me, because I would say a textile artist who I'm sort of constantly engaging with is Diedrich Brackens. And so much of Diedrich's work recently has been around sort of responding to the work of Essex Hemphill. And so I sort of see this very direct way in which the poetic enters that space. And I wanted to speak about the warp and the weft, because just to sort of transition into unspooling, the Grangewinde.
Yeah.
Correctly.
Grangewinde. Yes.
This is a recent piece of writing that you have sort of put together, responding to and very much in conversation with Gunta Stolzel, who was known to be the only woman in the Bauhaus weaving workshop. And thinking about how you're proposing this idea that between the warp and the weft, there are portals. And those spaces can also be sort of initiated or called to be grief portals. Mm-hmm. And so I was wondering if you could unpack that a bit for us here, because I've never sort of considered that, the space between, right? Like, there's so many different types of weaving techniques, but in my mind, there's always like a tightness and a tension between those two spaces. And so I'm never sort of thinking about the space between, or the fact that, very naturally textiles hold these various holds because they're handmade. Or originally handmade, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I would say as an aside, sometimes within the contemporary craft world, this whole thing around like, oh, handmade in the studio versus factory made. And I'm like, right. Workers are workers.
Mm-hmm.
Workers are workers.
Right.
So someone stitched this in a factory somewhere. I'm grateful for it.
Mm-hmm. Looks great.
Thank you. Weren't for you today. Thank you for asking me about this. I can read a short selection, just a couple pages from this. But what I will say first is that the spaces in between the threads are what makes the cloth useful to us.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a way in which sort of looping back to the beginning of our conversation and thinking about the surface of the screen and, like how it's possible to shoot things in like 4K now.
Right.
And the type of makeup which is required or not required, do whatever you want, but which folks might use.
Right.
If something is being shot in 4K to create this sort of disappearance of a pore.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean? I mean, just on I don't even know like the answer yet, but to me, it seems like such a, to me, it just seems like such a serious question. to be so deeply invested in the disappearance of the poor, you know?
Yeah. I mean, I think for me, it is a direct response to um, what is required of the entertainment industry, what we perceive as a society as perfection and beauty. Um, and also, I think, yeah, something that continues to push patriarchal standards of beauty. I think specifically on, you know, femme folks, um, and this idea of glamour, right? That this industry in particular has sort of fed us. Right.
Mhm. Mhm. Mm. I mean, yes, smoothness is we've been trained to think that it's seductive. Um,
Mhm.
and I feel like there's something which is like, there's another essay that's coming like underneath that around like,
Mhm.
why? What is so fearful? What are we so afraid of
Right.
with this open space?
Mm.
So I'm going to read a little bit from this piece, which will be published in the Textile Journal of Cloth and Culture whenever they get to it, probably later this spring, summer.
Mhm.
And actually this time last year, yeah, I was asked to write this thing, so it's kind of nice to be able to share it with y'all now. I start with a quote by W.S. Merwin from the poem Separation. Your absence has gone through me like thread through a needle. Everything I do is stitched with its color. So I started writing this again, like just before the pandemic kind of stopped, picked back up after California had gone into shutdown.
Mm.
Dear Gunta, we need to talk. I had been, as they say, going through it and flew back to the US after spending some time in Berlin for the Bauhaus Centennial. I had picked up an English copy of your letters to your brother Erwin, in Gunther Stotzel Bauhaus Master, while at MoMA, to see the Taking a Thread for a Walk exhibition. I needed to see your 1924 Van Biang. That's a wall hanging. You managed this 6 years after the end of World War I while working as a nurse, after one annulled engagement and without professional instruction in a country still recovering from war with few materials available. This seemed to me to be absolutely noteworthy. I did not see this information listed anywhere on the label adjacent to your work. You'd already endured so many losses up to that point. I remember standing there, my body still 5 hours ahead of New York time, feeling that your wall hanging was drawing something out of me. I cried. The museum guard pretended not to notice, but I could not ignore the feeling of an unspooling which was happening inside of myself. Each time I come back into this country, I am always haunted by feelings of loss. But maybe it is the travel which resensitizes me to the losses which are already coiled within, waiting for an invitation to express themselves. I come back to this experience because of a pandemic, a string of personal losses, and an uprising later. I realize your 1924 wall hanging was an invitation for me to think about the semiotics of cloth in another way. In service of greater literacy, we need to consider what the space between the threads can offer us when engaged in the study of cloth grammar. These open sites, absent of material thread bodies, are an integral part of the anatomy of the textile. I've never been one to believe that there's such a thing as empty space, right? So we kind of loop back to me being at the Jurassic residency and realizing that I'm not the only artist in residence in my abode.
Mm-hmm.
For me, there has never been anything passive about space or sight. In service of greater connection between us, Gunta, I want to consider my correspondence with you as the warp of the textile written here, and our individual correspondences with people we love in our lives as interlocking wefts through time, space, and language. And if we are lucky, that this might create a kind of ambiance in the minds of readers. Hear me out. Imagine for a moment there are threads which are not spun by the human hand. We can think of threads performatively as lines whose length represents distance between moments of time and whose orientation in space represents direction. Thread perceived in this way both includes and exceeds our understanding of silk or cotton or the particulars of polyester. I'd like to think of threads here as being pathways which begin at a moment of loss and are directed onward through each subsequent point of memory of that loss. Right? So like grieving is nonlinear, healing is nonlinear. The making of these grief threads then becomes a durational project. Grief threads, or die Granglewinden, are lines which hold the tension of grief as a tangle inside the body, a labyrinth. In Transformations of the Line, Traces, Threads, and Surfaces, Tim Ingold says of the labyrinth that it remains a powerful image of movement and wayfaring in a world of the dead that is believed to lie beneath the surface of the world of quotidian experience. I would offer that the world of the dead here extends to dead dreams, dead relationships, and dead expectations, all coiled around each other. Ingold reminds us that if line begins as a thread, so did text begin as a meshwork of interwoven threads. I believe this meshwork is composed of our stories of loss in our lives, which wait inside us until there is an opening for them to be expressed, which is what I believe that cloth can do for us. It's another one of the absorbing qualities of cloth. Gunta, I think the weaving, can be a way for us to find such openings which the warp and weft of woven cloth provide a frame for. Words ending in er, ei in your language are sites of activity. I believe the open sites in a textile act as portals which pull on these threadways inside of us, directing them outward over time, such that our losses begin to unspool outside of our bodies, threading through the open spaces of the cloth we find ourselves in the presence of. These thread portals, or die Gewindeportale, are active spaces which allow us to engage in the work of emptying our grief, acknowledging what we are losing, even as we do the work of accumulating wefts to create cloth. Weaving just isn't a strategy to map out what is there. It is also an opportunity to acknowledge the text of what we have lost as well. Rather than interpreting the presence of daylight through fabric as a passive opening, a byproduct of working with the forms of thread bodies, I would like to hover over these openings as a way to acknowledge the work that weaving does to track the losses, the places where we are emptied out by the grief in our lives. So I'll leave it, I'll leave it there. But I wanted to introduce these terms, de Grangewinde and Gewindeportale, as a way of trying to reach a hand out to Gunta through space and time. It's one thing for me to say grief thread and grief portal in English, but I need to be able to talk to her. Mm-hmm. And to understand enough about German that you can put, there's a way, like the compound words are like a huge thing. Mm-hmm. And having worked as an interpreter myself and understanding how malleable language can be, I worked with a translator in Berlin. And I said, I think that this grammatically could work. Right. Based on my very shaky understanding of German. What do you think? And she thought it was weird, but she gave me a go. So yeah, so I felt like last year for me was a wonderful time with the shuttering of so many exhibitions and whatnot, to be able to use the surface of the page to absorb all this research that my body mind has been doing in partnership with the Loom, in partnership with different types of tension, materials, social, otherwise. And yeah, to be able to make this kind of contribution to the field, because the space between threads has never been hovered over.
Mm. Mm. And I think this idea of being hovered over very much is tied into, I think, what you've mentioned before, a haunting, the fact that there's always a presence or multiple presences around you. And just because they aren't in the flesh doesn't mean that they aren't still there, that they don't exist, that they haven't contributed to your existence. Um, and so, what I really appreciate about this piece of writing, that it is not sort of written in the traditional academic sense of, um, sort of overview of Gunta's life and work, but rather a true engagement and conversation with Gunta, and sort of acknowledging that she is still with us, and that through these portals, there's a conversation happening.
Yeah, I feel like it's really, to be honest with you, moving forward, I just want to have conversations with people. I almost don't want to do interviews anymore,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
because I feel like what art calls for is our participation,
Mm-hmm.
which means that we're always implicated in the making of an experience.
Right. Yeah.
And I'm uninterested in participating in a fiction wherein one person is not implicated in the experience, and then somehow I'm just out here yapping away, you know? Um, and with that, I will offer you my last question, because I know we're close to time.
Yeah, we actually have some questions here in the chat that I want us to get to.
Um,
Amazing people.
I know. I'm greedy though, so I'm asking my question first.
Of course.
I'm all like,
Our space first.
yeah, totally. I'm like, that's cool, but so thinking about what it means to be an ancestor versus a ghost. So haunting also thinks, that's more within a ghostly realm.
Yeah, that's a great distinction.
Within a more ancestral realm, you're a light on someone's altar 500 years from now. What are they praying to you for?
Mental freedom. Thinking about the space of the unhinged as productive. And what mental liberation and exercise, imagination, I think. And to sort of go back to one of the projects that I hold near and dear to my heart, a Black radical imagination, what that does for the world, what that does for oneself, and how a Black radical imagination, in my opinion, is the most innovative sight and experience of a Western world. Yeah, I would say that. Black radical imagination.
That's a gorgeous anointing. Thank you.
Thank you for that question.
Someone's going to be writing about you. They're going to be writing a paper to you at one time. Yes, it's true.
Oh, Lord. Consider that. Also, that's interesting, the distinction between ancestor and ghost, because I immediately thought of Toni Morrison's Beloved,
Yes.
and questioning where Beloved actually falls between those two distinctions, but if there's possibility for hybridity, you know, so that's just something to sort of float around.
No, there's I know we have to get to the questions, but hold on.
Mhm.
There's something which is coming up for me around like yeah, my position in relationship to an entity. Is that what makes, I don't, like, how do we know that a haunting is a haunting? And how does our position sort of play into that? I don't know what the answer is, but there's something where I want to, I don't want to just put it all on the entity or all on the spirit and be like, are you hanging out here and da-da-da, it's because of what you're doing. Maybe it's because of something I'm doing too. Is it in my language?
Yeah. I was
And
gonna
how I speak to the entity, which makes it a ghost or an ancestor?
I think it's a very subjective answer, because I think we are taught certain discrepancies around language. I don't necessarily see a haunting as something particularly ghostly. I think you can be haunted by all sorts of entities and objects. I also feel like sort of what I think I have been taught in some ways is that, an ancestor is someone who has ascended to a higher plane, whereas a
Yes.
ghost is someone who perhaps has been stuck or is in a sort of purgatory and hasn't quite been released from this plane.
Yes.
So
Yes.
I think there's so many, but like culturally, historically, I mean, regionally, there's so many different ways to sort of, pontificate about that answer. But I do want to get to some of these questions.
Yeah,
We are,
absolutely. Donna, are you hopping back on?
yeah.
Hi.
Hi. Hi. Wow. Thank you so much for what an amazing, thoughtful conversation. I felt like we were sort of eavesdropping around your kitchen table, and I wish like all conversations could be like this.
A haunting, Donna.
I would echo a comment in the chat which said, yes, this conversation is so very needed and very much needed, and it really was. And we do have some questions in the chat. I also have a question. I want to be really brief because I want to get to the questions in the chat. But we came to this conversation today from a session we were having with the Alliance of Artists Communities, which was like a field conversation looking back on the past year, what are the lessons that we've learned. And one of the things that kept coming up was about this idea of slowness, rest, and kind of thinking about the themes you were raising about quiet and interiority. Jessica Moss, who's a curator and artist who runs a residency program called The Roll Up, was talking a lot about this, and mentioning Tricia Hursley, who runs a thing called the Nap Ministry, and kind of exploring this idea of rest as resistance. And thinking about our work in a residency, our primary job is not to care for objects, although we do have a curatorial program, our job is to care for people and to care for artists. And often artists come into our space and what they actually really need is rest. And they're there to rest, or maybe they're there even sometimes to grieve and to experience everything that as a human being you experience. And thinking about this, the role of the residency is it's a retreat into interiority, but it's also, and it's a retreat from public life, but it's also a launch back into, or maybe a preparation to launching back into. And anyway, this is a long way for me just to sort of ask you both for like a little bit about your thoughts on residency and its role that it can play in supporting these sort of interior spaces, and ways we might be able to think about doing that in a better way and a more supportive way for artists.
I mean, everyone needs sabbatical.
That's so true.
You know? That this is something which, I mean, it happens to be one of the perks of my field. There's a lot of things that are otherwise pretty wacky about an artist's working conditions. But yeah, you know, I think that there need to be more like non-medical, non-religious spaces where people can engage in contemplation. It's one of the ways in which a museum can function, where people can participate in quiet, in public, and that becomes like a norm, I think, within a dominant American culture, or North American culture, which privileges speed, exteriority, volume. But I think, yeah, I think it's about, you know, I'm an artist, so to a certain extent, I think I'm special, but really I'm just doing kind of like, I'm doing my part. And actually it's about creating spaces where I can be in the place of contemplation with folks who are working in other fields. Because artists, I believe, are, we're thinkers first. People love to forget that because they get distracted by the experiences that we create, either on the page or stage or in space. But that wouldn't come out of, that comes out of an inner life, you know? So really, I would love to be on residency with nurses, with Lyft drivers. Yeah, with the garbage man.
Yeah.
You know, if it's really about making work, I'm not making the work that I make because it's entertaining. It's not. It actually moves very slowly. And so a lot of folks won't have time for that. That's fine. But I think it's, my problem with America is that the role of the artist is so unclear outside of the art world and even within it. When I go abroad, folks are like, you know, and I can say, ich bin Künstlerin. People are like, oh, whoa, you're an artist? Cool. What do you think about the Syrian refugee crisis? What do you think about Brexit? What do you think about? They're not asking me what I make. They're not asking me if they can get one. They understand that my ability to sit in the space of the unknown and to work with tension allows me to think about problems in a nonlinear way, which might be interesting.
Right.
So I think organizing residencies around that kind of idea, you know, which means that you have to build in, obviously, like funding for people to take time off from their jobs so their families are still cared for. Maybe they bring their kids with them. I don't know.
Yeah.
But that's what it is. I enjoy being in conversation with other artists. Of course, it's a dream. It's lovely. But there's a whole world, and that's what I'm interested in.
Thank you, Indira. Yes, kind of reflects a little bit of our thinking, our current thinking. We're imagining in this moment, we're thinking about how can we bring together these cohorts of artist curated residencies where wouldn't necessarily all be artists. It's the opportunity to have a conversation with all kinds of people from all kinds of backgrounds. So yeah, it's like what's the capacity for this space for convening? What can it do now? Anyway, sorry, I'm very mindful of the time, so I want to make sure we get to the questions that are in the chat. Amanda would love to hear more about the ritual movement of the body in relation to weaving on a loom, and how that is a way to access the grief portals in the cloth.
Mm. The loom is a co-conspirator in the, it's a body built to hold tension. So it can hold me. And it can hold all of the Grangovinda, all of the grief threads, which are this meshwork of loss, which exists inside of me and everyone. Loss is a normal part of life. People talk about loss as if it arrived with COVID.
Right. That's so true.
But yeah, it's a way for me to be able to care for the desire that I have to be held and for that tension to be transformed some way.
Kelly, do you want to chime in too with any questions or any other questions?
Let's ask Dorothy's question. I have, I'm ready for the second course. I'm ready to talk for a while. And so let's move to Dorothy and then we'll come back.
Do you want me to read it?
Sure, or I can. You go ahead, Donna.
This is, so she says, regarding haunting or hovering, I would love to know the relationship between tension and density in your Indira's creative practice. And for Erin, I would love to know your thoughts on this as well.
Erin, please.
Tension and density.
And mobility in all its multitudes, as well as part of this question.
I would say I've been considering the density of Blackness as a color, as a space, as a portal, as a whole, as a color that is deeply reflective, or as a color that absorbs, I think, all other color. And I've been thinking about what it means when you are having a cinematic experience to be encased in a black box, and how the black box is different than the white box. The black box is very much in our society known as a cinematic space, whereas the white box is very much in our society known as an art exhibition space, and how I sort of am mobile between both of those spaces in my practice to sort of mention mobility and the multitudes of mobility. And the tension between both of those spaces, how they hold very different histories, how the black box typically asks for the viewer to be a sort of passive reactionary participant, and how the white box potentially asks the viewer to be a more active, engaged participant, and what it means to basically deconstruct both boxes and somehow attempt to weave them together, I would say, in my curatorial practice. So I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you, Erin. Yeah, I'm just thinking about that. I think this loops back to Donna, your question about the reimagination of the residency, and Erin thinking about imagination as being an anointing that you can offer people as an ancestor, and the word participation, right? And so like when we create spaces where people can come together and, you know, be in the durational practice of trust building, rest, conversation, exploration, they can receive the anointing, which is their own, of the ability to just imagine. And that's what turns the black box into an active space rather than a passive space.
Mm.
So we don't have the problem of whatever kind of participation is happening throughout.
Yeah, I like that interjection. Right? Because in order for the black box to exist, there has to be an imagination at hand that's creating a story that we can view, right? Otherwise, it's sort of this dormant space, or potentially dormant. I actually don't know if that's true. Yeah, and how blackness and darkness mimics perhaps an interiority and is a potential space for quiet, right? Yeah, and how black is the most dominant color, in my understanding, within the larger universe. It is the visual scape of
Yes,
the cosmos.
yes.
It holds the cosmos together. It weaves them together, you know? So, yeah, so much. We put
Amazing.
something together, Indira. Sing a
I'm,
definition.
I'm really reluctant to disrupt this conversation because it is really incredible, and feels like there's a lot more to unpack and unwrap. But I do have to just be a little mindful of our time, and I want to thank you both so much for today, for sharing your thinking and your work, and it's been really amazing and a real privilege. So thank you both so much.
Thank you both. Thank you to the artist residency. Thank you to the superheroes on the captioning service. Thank you to everyone who came. And Erin, it's an honor.
Oh, it's mutual. This conversation is really like, I'm ready to take on the world. Hyped, and I'm just gonna be like toying with black and white space and weaving all day. So Indira, thank you for being such an innovative mind. Thank you for engaging this, as you said, thousands of year old tradition in such an innovative and radical way. And yeah, I appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you. I'm all like, let's go get it.
paid to go get it. This was incredible. This, I think about our work as weaving all the time in these spaces of void, these spaces in between. It's where the magic happens. And I couldn't be more grateful. Thank you for just putting yourself in this space and sharing.
Right on. Have a good weekend, everyone.
You too.
Thank you. Kelly, would you like to quickly tell us what's coming up in
Absolutely.
next week? Not next week, in the next couple of weeks for Scratch Space.
So on April the 8th, we'll be joined in Scratch Space by LucasArts Fellow and author Zane Jukadar and writer and the former manager of our residency program, Lori Wood. And they will discuss Zane's latest novel, The 30 Names of Night, a moving and lyrical story following 3 generations of Syrian Americans who are linked by a mysterious species of bird and the truths they carry close to their hearts. We'll explore how this work was incubated and developed in the residency at both the LucasArts residency program as well as the residency program Lori is now running in the Fez Medina project. Looking forward to that conversation. Looking forward to being back here with you, Donna. You and I have a lot to think about over this weekend.
We do. Thank you everyone again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you.